Welcome to Magazzino da Casa. My name is Teresa Kittler and I'm the 2020-2021 Scholar in Residence at Magazzino Italian Art, the museum and research centre dedicated to advancing the scholarship and public appreciation of post-war and contemporary Italian art in the United States. As a non-profit museum, now in its fourth year, it has been advancing and celebrating the work of Italian artists from Arte Povera to the present day. Today, we welcome you back for the second lecture of 4 in our annual series, which is now in its third year and has been an occasion to explore new directions in the scholarship and research on post-war Italian art. This year, we turn our attention to friendships and partnerships within Arte Povera to consider to what extent collaboration forms part of the narrative of artistic production in Italy in the post-war period. I've been interested, along with the other speakers, in exploring some of the challenges faced by this question, whether it's possible to think beyond the trope of the muse when addressing the contribution of women as partners in the work of this period, and how dialogue and exchange have visibly shaped the work of otherwise well-known male figures. Organising this series has also been a collaborative effort with my colleagues here at Magazzino, and I'd like to thank them all for their support in putting this together. And a special thanks to Alexandra Theodoropoulou, Eve Aron, Carolina Kwiatkowska, Juliette Vincente, and Magazzino's director, Vittorio Calabrese. The lectures will continue to run on alternate Saturdays through to May the 1st, and you can find out more about each event on Magazzino's website page, Magazzino da Casa. Each lecture lasts around 40 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session to which we encourage you all to participate with comments or questions, and you can do so by signing in and using the chat function during the talk. It's a real pleasure to introduce the second speaker today, Dr. Sharon Hecker, a tour de force in the field of post-war Italian art, and her lecture is titled Mutually Impressed and Distanced, Luciano Fabro's Creative Collaborations with Women. And the talk begins a series of focused case studies around friends and couples within Arte Povera. Sharon's paper will critically examine Luciano Fabro's creative collaborations with women through photographs, videos, and unpublished letters related to his art, spanning from Fabro's early collaborations with Carla Lonzi and Marinella Pirelli, an experimental performance video Indumenti of 1966, to his sustained but less visible collaboration with his daughter Silvia and his wife Carla throughout his career. Hecker will explore Fabro's engagement with these individuals as both creative partners and subjects. Sharon Hecker is an art historian and curator specializing in modern and contemporary Italian art. She's a leading authority on Nadezhda Russo, has published on Lucio Fontana, Marisa Merz, and Francesco Lo Savio. Hecker's books include A Moment's Monument, Nadezhda Russo and the International Origins of Modern Sculpture, awarded CAA's Miller's Mice Publication Prize and translated into Italian. She co-edited with Maren Sullivan Post-War Italian Art History Today, Untying the Knot, with Silvia Bottinelli, led in modern and contemporary art, and edited Finding Lost Wax, the disappearance and rediscovery of an ancient casting technique and the experiments of Nadezhda Russo. For her research, Hecker has received awards from the Getty, Fulbright, and Mellon Foundations. She co-curated exhibitions at Harvard University Art Museums and the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, and is currently preparing an exhibition on Lucio Fontana's ceramics at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection for 2025. Perhaps most relevant for today, she worked for Luciano Fabro in the 1990s, translated his theoretical writings with him for his retrospective at San Francisco MoMA, and has published 10 critical essays on his work over the last decade, including in the Oxford Art Journal. She was also invited by the Brooklyn Rail to guest edit an issue dedicated to Fabro in 2018. So a very warm welcome, Sharon, and I hand over to you to share your screen and to start your talk.
Okay, let's see. Is the audio good? Can it be heard? I just want to make sure. Is this good, the audio? And everybody can see. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. There's many people to thank. I'd like to, first of all, thank Magazzino Italian Art for inviting me to speak to you today. Also to the incredibly collaborative couple, Nancy and Giorgio Spanu, to Teresa Kittler for organizing this wonderful lecture series, director Vittorio Calabrese, and most especially Silvia Fabro, who kindly provided archival material for this talk. So I'd like to begin by reading a report of a dream that the artist Luciano Fabro had about the art critic Carla Lonzi after her death. He described it in the preface to the German translation of her 1969 book Autoritratto, and I quote, "After she died, there was a dream that I want to remember once again. We were walking among the dunes, feeling the wind, but not seeing the sea. I had been careful at the meeting not to touch her, knowing that she was a ghost. But then, in the heat of our conversation, a gesture of tenderness came over me. My hand went empty. She said, 'Sorry.' I said, 'It's okay.' And we continued." End quote. For me, Fabro's dream encapsulates in one powerful, brief, and uneasy image the theme of my lecture today, which I've titled Mutually Impressed and Distanced, Luciano Fabro's Creative Collaborations with Women. On the one hand, the dream speaks of a strong sense of connectedness, two people walking together, engaged in a dialogue, which the artist recounts as being an animated conversation. On the other hand, there is Fabro's recognition of distance, that Lonzi is a ghost, no longer physically present, making palpable his sense of their detachment and an emptiness between them. At some point, overcome by a deep feeling of tenderness, the dreamer instinctively attempts to move in to fill the void. This is followed by his painful realization that the distance between the two cannot be bridged. This is echoed by the setting, the two walking among sand dunes where they can feel the wind but not see the sea. The dreamer says that all this is okay, and that the dialogue, marked by presence and absence, can still continue in this way. Fabro's dream opens a broader discussion about the ways in which his collaborations with women seems to have involved the condition of being mutually impressed by each other and at the same time requiring distance. In this talk, I'd like to examine Fabro's approach to collaborating with women in his life and art. I'll divide the talk into three parts. The first will be on Fabro's public collaborations with art critics like Carla Lonzi and Yola de Santa. The second will be on more private collaborations with family members. And the third on a selection of artworks by Fabro that speak to the notion of collaborations with women, or how such collaboration can be inscribed in artistic production. Before proceeding, I feel that two premises are in order. First, when we speak about collaborations, we need to define what we mean. The etymological roots of the terms co, together, mutually, in common, and labor, the act of work. Even more delicate is when the creative collaborations we're discussing occurs between a man and a woman, and gender dynamics can come into play. I think that there are different levels of understanding of women as cultural and intellectual laborers, especially in the context of Italy and the particularities of its gender dynamics, and this is the subject of my upcoming co-edited volume. We should remember that not all women labored culturally in the same way. Not all made their collaborations public, nor did all seek to receive public recognition for a myriad of reasons. We need to be respectful of the fact that we may not always be able to fully grasp from outside the intricate interpersonal dynamics involved in each collaboration. Second, I want to render transparent my own position and approach today, which reflects and holds together two disparate viewpoints. In the early 1990s, when I was in my 20s, I worked for Fabro and have some lived experience of the matters under discussion. At the time, I lacked critical tools with which to fully understand and interpret what I was experiencing. 30 years have now passed, and I approach the subject from the viewpoint of an art historian, with the distance and tools of professional critical thinking. I also benefit from recent scholarship on some of the figures under discussion, as well as my own critical essays on Fabro. While I've been able to incorporate new archival material, I don't wish to force historical interpretations where supporting documents are lacking, so I've tried to keep separate facts and interpretations or conjectures. Finally, I'd like to draw on this presentation of Fabro's approach to collaborating with women as a springboard to think about what it can mean to work together in the visual arts. I hope to examine what a collaboration may signify for each participant, even if the word itself is fraught, while doing my best to avoid the trap of romanticizing or heroizing or fetishizing the individuals involved or the working relationships generated. My aim is to show that each collaborator has a story worth telling, even when the roles might be different, and at times there may be inequalities among the collaborators. There is a mutual task to be achieved. In Fabro's case, he is aware that ultimately this task is to work together for the purpose of advancing culture. Let's go on to focus on the collaboration between Fabro and Lonzi. They met when Fabro was 29, just setting out as an artist. Lonzi was 34, but had already consolidated her professional identity as an art critic for a decade. Fabro recounted that he and Lonzi met through Enrico Castellani in 1965, and that the connection between the young artist and the critic was immediate. They were mutually impressed by one another. He recalled, and I quote, "She was immediately considered very friendly, simpatica. In fact, within a month, we'd already done the first interview. Between us, it was almost like lightning had struck, quasi un colpo di fulmine." Lonzi's first interview with Fabro about his earlier show at the Galleria Vismara was published in April 1966 in the Genoese contemporary art journal Marca Tre. As Laura Iamurri has pointed out, the relationship between Fabro and Lonzi was defined by a particularly strong sense of mutual empathy. It might well be that this was the case with other artists too, but today I'm going to be focusing on this pair. From Fabro's viewpoint, one of the reasons for the intensity of the connection was his sense of a true meeting of minds. He recalled that he had considered Lonzi a partisan among us, una partigiana tra di noi. And like other artists, he appreciated her decisive stand against critics who, in his mind, were trying to organize groups of artists into movements or tendencies. The tone of their first interview, in the shape of an informal discussion, was transformative for both. For Lonzi, it would become a template in her approach to interviewing other artists for autoritratto. For Fabro, Lonzi seemed to see each artist as an individual with their own particularities. She achieved this by an innovative adoption of the tape recorder for interviews, which allowed artists to hear back their own voices and have their thoughts transcribed without much filtering, at least initially. Fabro said that he felt Lonzi played a vital role as a sounding board, una cassa di risonanza, but it's clear that he saw her as more than a mere echo. He felt she was a key critical voice who could intelligently amplify artists' ideas about contemporary Italian art while remaining faithful to their thinking and approaches. He appreciated the strength of her writing and her desire to be, quote, literarily and stylistically different in her texts on art, which have been gathered in the volume by Lara Conte, Iamurri, and Vanessa Martini. Fabro would recall Lonzi as a key go-between who kept artists up to date about what was going on in the art scenes of different cities, Rome, Milan, Turin. In doing so, she worked to generate interest in their art around Italy. For Fabro, Lonzi was an animating force. He recounts a document of protest that he tried to get artists to sign after the 1968 Venice Biennale and Triennale, but was unsuccessful until Lonzi arrived on the scene. They then wrote the text together and published it, co-signed by Giulio Paolini, and she later reproduced it in Autoritratto. Additionally, Lonzi provided Fabro with creative stimulus for his art. In 1966, for example, he made the work Incubo, Incube, an inhabitable cubit space created according to the dimensions of his own body that allowed the person who entered the space to inhabit it and isolate from the outside world. He then made a version for Carla Lonzi according to the dimensions of her body. As the title Incubo per Carla Lonzi indicates, this was made as an homage to her. She did not own the work. And he often exhibited both incubi together as if to show an awareness of difference and distance within this intimate professional relationship. Incubo per Carla Lonzi may have served Fabro as a creative form of doubling, to move beyond the self towards another. This allowed him to rework, expand, and diversify an initial artistic impetus, gradually moving towards a broader artistic gesture, extending towards a relational other. This move from an io to an interpersonal relational tu would become a template or recurring artistic theme in Fabro's art. Io and tu, in fact, would be the titles of two works that Fabro would make a decade later, both in the shape of eggs, with the hollow receptive io, you see on one side, made to the dimensions of his own body, crouched in a fetal position, while tu was a tiny compact egg filled with red sealing wax. Here you see it cradled in the artist's hand. This was part of Fabro's awareness that even the most intimate relationships and charged first impressions received during the initial conception of an artwork must be extended outwards to friends and then to the world. As Lonzi would write, anybody was invited to lift up and get inside Fabro's Incubo when it was exhibited, thus moving art into the greater flow of history. Fabro also intended to make more incubi for other friends, according to their own dimensions. That Fabro and Lonzi saw themselves as having different roles to perform in the art world is evident in the pose that each one strikes in a group photo taken in 1966 by Anna Piva. Fabro's pose, with his arms wide open in the center there, replicates his artwork of the time Croce, but also relates to Incubo. In the same photo, Lonzi, who you see on the left, chooses to place her hands together, holding within them an open book. This suggests her conscious perception, at least in that moment, of her distinct function and purpose as a writer, rather than the more traditional female roles of helper, inspirer, sounding board, or muse. Another example of the collaboration and different roles of Fabro and Lonzi in the same period captures the generative process. In the same year as Incubo and the Piva photo, during a casual dinner with Lonzi and the experimental filmmaker Marinella Pirelli, Pirelli documents a private spontaneous performance of Fabro tracing with paper the shape of Lonzi's bare breasts in order to create a bra for her. The image series has formerly been titled Indumenti Apparel, but it was never shown in their lifetimes and was first seen in a 2019 exhibition of Pirelli's works. Therefore, it would be dangerous to attribute singular or public importance to these images. We don't know what conversations among Fabro, Lonzi, and Pirelli gave rise to this impromptu generative act. As with the extended gesture of Incubo, Fabro apparently made numerous artistic gestures like this one that were not filmed, and this may not have been the first time he made the bra. In this case, what may the gesture have meant for each collaborator? For Fabro, the son of a seamstress, he used his mother's skills to create a physical pattern as well as a form of artistic expression. From Fabro's perspective, the collaboration between the two exemplifies a kind of knowledge that he can gain only through the hands and the fingers. Here we remember his later dream of wanting to reach out and touch Lonzi and the realization of his hands not being able to do so due to her ghostly presence. We witness the vitality of what he called the haptic power of nonverbal communication via touch, the way the making of an artwork can originate in a charged corporeal moment. This haptic gesture would become a template for Fabro's later artistic enterprise. An example of this is the 1977 Apollo e Daphne in Magazzino's collection. This manipulated photograph homes in on the moment of physical contact between Apollo the Pursuer and the Fleeing Daphne in a sculpture by Bernini, just as Daphne is being saved from ravishment by Apollo when she begins to turn into a laurel tree. In this work, Fabro reverses the story by making Daphne's leaves appear to penetrate Apollo. Fabro's process of making what he later would call indumenti can be seen to begin through collaborations, with an intensely intimate physical moment of mutual connection. It would then develop through a gradual process of distancing. He would go on to produce a series of bras, socks, and jockstraps for friends, and on one occasion he performed the act of making these objects publicly on anonymous male and female viewers. This is not Carla Lonzi. He exhibited the results isolated under plexiglass. Again, these are not Lonzi's bras, no longer connected to the bodies upon which they had originally been modeled. What may Fabro's original gesture have meant for Lonzi? We can perhaps imagine a meaning through a later entry in her diary, in which she recalls her interest in becoming an art critic came about through her feeling that she had gained privileged access to art in the moment of its coming into being. Lonzi's sense of her own agency thus derived from her access to the generative artistic act. Through her acceptance to stand still, she could have escaped or refused, and the intimacy of the relationship she had created with Fabro, he is able to move around her body and create art, while she is able to be part of and to observe firsthand art's coming into being. The collaboration between Fabro and Lonzi is central to the genesis of her autoritratto, self-portrait, published in 1969 upon her return from 6 months in the United States. Her initial idea for the cover was to have a photo taken in which Fabro would perform the baciamano, the hand kiss. She had very precise ideas about how this photo should be made. She originally wanted it to happen in her home in Rome and wished the photo to be taken by her partner Pietro Consagra. However, for reasons unexplained, the photo ended up being taken not in Rome but in Milan, not by her partner Consagra, but by photographer Ugo Mulas, and not in her home, but at Fabro's one-person exhibition at the Galleria di Niburg behind, his enormous lead artwork, Corona da Loro Facsimile. And this is the photo that came of it. In the Mulas photo, Lonzi instructed Fabro to gallantly kiss her outstretched hand. This gesture was traditionally associated with a bowing to power and royalty. Was Lonzi seeking recognition from artists for her efforts? Its performative nature creates a humorous moment of frisson between the two public figures. Fabro's massive circular lead artwork resting at their feet pulls the viewer's eyes downwards. Today, this photo is often used in catalogs and essays to illustrate Fabro's sculpture. The photo did not make it onto the cover of Lonzi's book or even into its pages. A more innocuous shot of the two, seen here, can be found inside the book, along with other family photos and art objects of all the artists' interviews. These were Fabro's 2 selections for the book, and these were his family photos of his newborn daughter Silvia, himself as a child, and his family in Friuli. Why did the cover of the book ended up showing a work by Fontana instead of the image that she had originally planned? We know from Yamuri's research that this was the editor's, not Lonzi's, choice. What effect these compromises may have had on Lonzi remains unknown. The final 2 collaborations between Fabro and Lonzi occurred in 1970, after Lonzi published Autoritratto, and just before she decided to abandon the art world and publish her feminist manifesto. On May 30th, Fabro was invited to exhibit in Processi di pensiero visualizzati at the Kunstmuseum Luzern. In the catalog, at the margins, across the top and the side of the photographs of several of his Italie, Fabro invited Lonzi to add extracts of her own writings from the Manifesto di Rivolta Femminile, written with Carla Accardi and Elvira Banotti, which they would post on the streets of Rome and Milan 2 months later. Something of an equal form of collaboration between Fabro and Lonzi may seem to have been born in this collage of his images and her words, a gesture that, as Laura Yamuri writes, was, quote, capable of holding the 2 interventions distinct. This distinction and differentiation seems to me to have been a crucial step towards acknowledging the value of each collaborator within the same space. I like to think of collaborations as a duet, where each voice has its role and two voices perform simultaneously, but at times also singularly to produce music. What kind of relational dialogue did Lonzi hope to achieve between Fabro's artworks and her writings? It has been recently argued that her texts help to emphasize the political nature of his works. However, such a reading would accord no agency to Lonzi and would give her only a supporting role in Fabro's creation, a role that she dreaded. Perhaps this needs to remain an open question. It seems odd to me that Lonzi chose to present her work in French translation. This was likely not done for the audience, since the show was held in German-speaking Lucerne. Perhaps, when placed alongside Fabro's Italie, it suggests Lonzi's wish to be backed by the strong, long-standing French roots of feminism, creating a contrast with her sense of Italy's backward position or political stance on women. The following month, Fabro was invited to an exhibition Amore Miyo, held in Palazzo Ricci in Montepulciano. He chose a room decorated with images of women, you see on the right, in which he took up Lonzi's approach of using a tape recorder to record a repetitive sentence on the role of artists and political responsibility, piped from the room onto the street through a loudspeaker, you see in the photo on the left. In the catalog, Fabro gave over to Lonzi all the space allotted to him after his biography. And Lonzi chose to use the following 8 pages rather than, say, sharing the space equally with Fabro. She chose to print reproductions of an obscure gathering of the ideas of the early 19th century utopian sociologist Charles Fourier, published in a book by Edward Silberling in 1911, titled Dictionnaire de sociologie phalanstérienne, and reprinted by a New York antique book publisher, Burt Franklin, in 1964. Her use of this reprint leads me to imagine she found the book while she was in the U.S. Lonzi probably chose this French text because Fourier was considered at the time to be the first person to use the word féminisme in his writings of 1837, although that's now been disproved. Here again, Lonzi seems to seek backing, support, and justification for her endeavor from French sources sympathetic to feminism. Only on the last page of the photostats does she mark her presence by signing her own name almost timidly. Fabro's gesture towards Lonzi is read as generous by Yamuri. She notes that Fabro was the artist who accompanied Lonzi on her journey towards self-discovery and feminism, recognizing, and I quote, Fabro's special role in Lonzi's path, constructed over the preceding years around the main qualities of her work, and then confirmed in that phase of chronological passage between the publication of Autoritratto and the publication of her feminist manifesto. But what of Lonzi's feeling about being invited into another space in the catalog? Was this the only way she believed she could have a voice in the art world? What did these actions mean about her own agency and value, and her decision a month later to embrace feminism? Fabro was deeply disappointed by Lonzi's abrupt withdrawal from the art world in July 1970. It has been assumed that their relationship ended at this point. However, the unpublished letters and photographs I examined suggest that the friendship actually continued at least until 1976. Indeed, in her 1974 autobiography, Lonzi recalled that it was Fabro who had helped her apprehend art in a less reverential way, quote, through an art that was more tied to one's self-discovery of its many facets without a prefixed center. Lonzi also contributed a brief text to the exhibition Indumenti Apparel in 1980, and Fabro and his wife Carla visited Lonzi in the hospital before she died. In later years, Fabro said that he felt that the medication Lonzi took for her illness influenced her erratic behavior and decision to abandon her career as an art critic. Fabro felt contemporary Italian art had lost what could have been a valuable alternative voice to what came to be known as the history of Arte Povera. Still, through Lonzi, Fabro may have strengthened his self-awareness about the autonomy of the artist and the complex nature of close collaborations, as well as his ongoing desire to maintain a measure of distance from Arte Povera throughout his career. Whatever Lonzi's attitude towards the art world, Autoritratto continued to have lasting importance for Fabro even after her death, as in his dream of their ghostly collaboration. I know this personally because in 1990, when I began to work for Fabro, one of the first things he did was to hand me a bound photocopied version he had made of the book long out of print and forgotten, which he insisted was crucial for understanding his work 20 years after its publication. And you can see that he even marked for me the passages he thought that I should be reading. As Giovanna Zapperi confirms in her book on Lonzi, there was no scholarship about her at the time, thus I had no way to assess her significance and impact. But I did sense her writing's ongoing importance for Fabro and began to see his identification with the role of a transmitter of culture. His efforts to have Autoritratto translated into German in 2000, in collaboration with Johannes Gachnang, Paulini, and others, supports my sense that he wished her writing on art to reach a larger international audience. After his collaboration with Lonzi ended, Fabro began working with Yola de Santa. Their relationship was based on their shared desire to create a communal, social, and political sensitivity around art through education and collaboration with young artists. It suggests that we might need to conceptualize these artistic collaborations not only as a dyadic fusion of two, but also the ways they extended outwards towards groups. Desana was an art historian and teacher and produced several biographies of Fabro that are essential texts for scholars today. Together, Fabro and Desana organized a group to occupy the Mulino Stucchi in Venice in 1975 when he was invited to the Biennale to imagine a new use for the old factory, but found the gates closed upon his arrival. There they are, climbing the gates. And here they are inside, working as a group. In 1978, the two collaborated with Hidetoshi Nagasawa on the revitalization of the Casa dei Artisti in Milan. And again, you can see how it extended outwards even to artists such as Dada. They created a civil service for art, putting out numerous publications, as well as public initiatives, including the restoration of Giorgio de Chirico's sculpture at the Triennale. The collaboration was interrupted by Yola's tragic death in a car accident in 2004 on her return trip from Fabro's inauguration at the Musée Bordel, and this was the last photo. When I met Fabro in 1990, I simultaneously met Desana, who had recently begun writing a book on Medardo Rosso, as well as Fabro's wife Carla, by profession a teacher, and his daughter Silvia, who was studying art history. Each of these women had her own professional identity and was able to succeed in other realms while collaborating with Fabro. And this is a beautiful unpublished photo by Ugo Mulas that is affectionately titled The Sagra Familia. We might not tend to think of professional art figures such as Lonzi and Desana on the same plane as collaborative family members, but perhaps this deserves rethinking. In some ways, I feel uncomfortable when speaking about personal relationships between artists and their partners and children who are not always professionals in the art world, because I don't quite know how to define these figures. They're less tidily grouped in the category of collaborations. Carla Fabro had a private, lifelong collaboration with Luciano as his wife. It was complex, deep, intimate, and long-lasting. Yet such collaborations tend to remain publicly invisible, emerging sometimes only after an artist's death. How can we discuss and assess the immeasurable value of ongoing, private forms of daily exchange and intellectual collaborations in a domestic family setting? And here they are installing his piedi with the stockings. How do we regard the imbalance between the public figures and of the artist and family members who provide a constant, trusted, intimate, safe space for the artist and a seemingly inexhaustible, sometimes obligatory form of labor, especially when these figures are intelligent, self-realized women? Do we need to invent another category? And this is Fabro with his wife and his mother, who is actually the person who sewed the stockings for the piedi. For Fabro, the boundaries between public and private were permeable, as for most people involved in the art world of that period. I found out recently that Carla Fabro was involved in Lonzi's Rivolta Femminile of 1970. Her daughter Silvia played with Lonzi's son Tita during the meetings. It was Carla Fabro who preserved all copies of the Rivolta publications. Lonzi's letters from the United States are addressed to both Carla and Luciano Fabro. These letters seem quite happy, but Fabro later bitterly recalled in an interview some of Lonzi's darker sides. On one occasion, she locked the artist's wives into their homes to impede them from going to their husbands' openings. Anna Piva and Carla Fabro managed to escape. And I love this photo of Carla Fabro with Luciano Fabro's ovaie, taken by Luciano because it is in Magazzino's collection. According to an interview with Fabro's daughter, Fabro's legacy was always considered a family matter. Fabro's first monograph of 1983 was what they called the first family work, lavoro di famiglia. It was produced in the domestic spaces of their living room, and the whole family was involved in different ways. Most of my work with the Fabros happened in their home. Silvia termed this kind of work a joint project, un lavoro comune. Carla and Silvia collaborated with Luciano in countless ways. Carla constructed bibliographies and cataloged original documents. Here they are working on one. And photos. Silvia, who was captured by Luciano in photos next to artworks as a child, worked on material issues such as transportation of artworks to exhibitions, how to install them, documenting materials and techniques used in their making. Silvia's interest in her father's material legacy was both personal and professional. Her university research on the restoration and conservation of contemporary art happened just as this field was emerging and was of interest to her father when they began to work on preserving his legacy. He called restorers the Vestals of art. It was in her words, every catalog entry was the result of, quote, long and repeated discussion among us, never losing sight of each other's work, always crossing paths with each other. Silvia's collaboration continues with Fabro posthumously since she now heads the archive that promotes his legacy. As a gesture of esteem for her mother's role, Silvia named the archive in honor of both Luciano and Carla Fabro. My collaboration with Fabro, Desana, Carla, and Silvia for his first U.S. retrospective at San Francisco MoMA in 1992 always involved working together as a group in ongoing discussion. And again, I love this photo because this piede that's behind us ended up in Magazzino's collection. The three Fabros used to drive me crazy because they only spoke Friulian dialect with each other, especially when arguing, creating an impenetrable unit. But our collaborations bore lasting fruits. We translated his theoretical writings, lecture, and speeches into English together, always through personal dialogue. And here are some female collaborators with Fabro. I ended my collaboration with Fabro when I decided to go to graduate school to develop a separate professional voice as an art historian. In an interview that recently resurfaced, Fabro stated that the particular conceptual choices we made in the construction of our San Francisco catalog produced an important template for all his future catalogs. I'd like to dedicate the last part of my talk to how the theme of collaborations with women is inscribed in Fabro's art. In three works, he draws an intellectual and creative connection with the idea of fidelity, and he chooses important marital relationships as subject and metaphor. These works allow us to reflect conceptually on what it might mean to work together, opening a broader discussion about the notion of commitment, not only regarding a relationship to another person, but also to one's own creative process and to the themes of joint ethical and moral commitment to the preservation and transmission of culture. At the same time, they meditate on the need for a measure of productive separateness and distance, a discreteness within union, something that can be a great and constant human challenge, but is ultimately necessary for collaboration to occur. I realize that the word marriage can be fraught with patriarchal stigma and gender equalities, but in these works, I think marriage might suggest a metaphorical and aspirational notion of a working collaboration in the sense of what a committed union can produce. I think of C.S. Lewis's quote that the most precious gift that marriage gave me was the constant impact of something very close and intimate, yet all the time unmistakably other, resistant, in a word, real. La Vera, the wedding ring, was made in 1969. The title La Vera means both fidelity in marital relationships and the true one. It began as a performance at Galleria La Salita in Rome, in which Fabro signed the wedding rings of his married friends and the rings of his single friends so they wouldn't feel left out. He then transformed this concept into an artwork consisting of a leather booklet containing a print of his wedding picture with Carla Fabro on one side and a gold reproduction of his wedding ring on the other. When the book is closed, the ring leaves a permanent circular impression superimposed on the couple's photograph. Two people, but also two different materials, come together, having an indelible effect on one another. In this work, soft photographic paper and hard metal, held and bound together by semi-soft leather, provides a permanent permeable matrix upon which the ring and photo can remain mutually impressed. At the same time, this work reflects on the possibility that relationships require distance, for the book needs to be open and each side separated in order to be seen by viewers and function as a single artwork. On the one hand, La Vera is based on a unique, intimate, private moment. On the other hand, as illustrated by the generative processes behind Indumenti and Incubo, Fabro went on to make the object as a series. He gave me one as a gesture of thanks for my collaboration on his SF MoMA show, and another version is here in Magazzino's collection. Fabro's 1972 Penelope allows us to reflect on the deeper meaning of a woman's need to develop a sense of her own agency when she finds herself in a collaboration. The work consists of two elements, needles and thread. The threads zigzag up and down the wall, held fast by the needles, but could only be easily be undone by a dangling thread left unfastened at the end. The title and the image conjure up the epic queen of Ithaca, wife of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey, who wove on a loom by day and unwove by night while waiting for him to return. Although suitors continuously pressed for her hand in marriage during Odysseus' absence, she was able to resist by saying that first she had to weave a shroud for the tomb of her father-in-law Laertes. She secretly unwove the shroud each night in order to never finish and remain faithful to her husband and the marriage. By re-envisioning her act of weaving, Fabro gives importance to Penelope. His sense of her value fits with new thinking about this myth. While traditionally considered the passive wife who stayed within the confines of her home, patiently at work at her loom as her husband went off to battle or other adventures, today Penelope is thought to have agency. Once considered a secondary figure, now she's considered the co-protagonist of the Odyssey. Scholars have come to realize that Penelope and Odysseus are like-minded. For example, they both possess a spirit of deception. If today the notion of deception has only negative connotations, in classical times, the artful trick was seen as a form of superior intelligence. Weaving and unweaving is Penelope's skill as a cunning spinner of ruses, as well as her link with the equally crafty Odysseus, and also a master fabricator of stories. This link can be extended to the author Homer and the playful open-ended nature of his tales. Similarly, Fabro's sense of like-mindedness with Penelope's crafty labor is the motor for the creation of this work, including leaving the final thread unfastened. Yet although like-minded, Penelope and Odysseus function differently. According to classicist Richard Heitman in his book, which is aptly titled Taking Her Seriously, and I quote, "However much Penelope and Odysseus are alike in their goals and strength of their resolve, they differ significantly in how they use their mental powers. Odysseus is defined by the varied, the multiple, the diverse. Penelope remains remarkably unified, immovable in her purpose and strategy." This sense of difference is a crucial aspect of Fabro's Penelope, where needles and thread each have a different job to do, but can function when working together according to their own distinct physical properties. In Fabro's work, the needle's fixed point of stability, the soft thread renders the sharp needle functional, just as the sequence of needles gives direction and purpose to the otherwise limp thread. In his writings on this work, Fabro intimates that the identities of needle and thread do not fuse, nor does one identify with the other, and this is the condition through which they can collaborate. Today's scholars note Penelope's steady-mindedness in her difficult situation, a characteristic that Fabro wrote he admired as a requisite for making art. In the story, Penelope leans on a pillar whenever she appears on the roof of her house during Odysseus' absence, although Heitman notes that her need is purely metaphorical, for Penelope, and I quote, "has such a firm grip on herself that one wonders whether she needed to have been tied to the mast in order to have resisted the sirens." Penelope remains empidos, grounded, echephron, level-headed at all times, even as she continues to nurture her suitor's hope, pine for her absent husband, and question her fate. She emerges as a resourceful partner, consciously rooted and existing in dialectical opposition to her husband, who leaves and then comes back. Thus, paradoxically, her lack of mobility becomes her agency, and her weaving creates this fixity. For today's readers of Homer, as in Fabro's work, Penelope's unweaving is an intricate form of poetic shaping. Her constant movement between weaving and unweaving is a way of staying centered within her feelings of fidelity to the memory of Odysseus. Like Fabro, she remains faithful to her process, traversing back and forth the practical limits of what her materials can and can't do, distilling the two poles into an essential artful gesture. It's via her unweaving that she comes to be defined by the world as patient and faithful to her cause, and her unique mythic self is constellated. Without the undoing, Penelope would just be another Greek woman who weaves. Penelope sees that her tie to Odysseus is part of a larger history. It is the thread that keeps joined the fabric of her marriage, family, household, kingdom, as well as past and present future generations of one family, like a genealogical tree. She therefore becomes the live connection that runs from her father-in-law to her absent husband to her son, whose interests she protects through her actions. This is like Fabro, who envisions his task as a transmission of culture from past to future, as something that happens through collaborations. My final example suggests collaboration for a higher purpose, as a common struggle to preserve culture through Fabro's 1909 monument to Nadezhda Mandelstam. The installation Nadezhda, a huge marble slab hanging by a belt, rests on a book by Mandelstam, who memorized her exiled husband's Osip's poetry after his death in a Siberian gulag. She was not able to write down her memories of their experience under the regime until after Stalin's death, decades later in 1953. Her manuscript, titled Hope Against Hope, which plays ambivalently on the meaning of her name, was smuggled into the United States in the 1950s and published in English in 1970. Fabro was deeply moved by the fact that Nadezhda had preserved the events in her mind for decades, and that she similarly saved from oblivion her husband's poems, officially ordered to be destroyed, by memorizing them and by hiding fragments of his verses on scraps of paper between pots and pans. As part of the first exhibition of this work at the Christian Stein Gallery, Fabro evoked these written fragments with phrases from Nadezhda's book that he had printed on candy wrappers. He entrusted the task of handing out the wrapped candy to art students. In her memoirs, Nadezhda had bitterly recalled that candies were given to her whenever Stalin's police searched their apartment. Fabro meant to suggest through his candy distribution a symbolic gesture. The viewer's acts of eating the candies and reading Nadezhda's phrases in which the treats came wrapped were meant to replicate Nadezhda's act of ingesting her husband's poems and preserving their memories as a form of cultural safeguarding. Is Nadezhda's book holding up Fabro's massive stone, or perhaps Fabro's heavy marble object is protecting the memoirs? Are both being held in place from the belt from above? The stone, book, and belt, combining text and image, together represent an innovative contemporary monument. The work reshapes the traditional monument's authoritative masculine language and minimalism's virile physical prowess in homage to an intelligent female subject. Here, Fabro honored, quote, the effort of silence and the power of uncensorable words, memorializing Nadezhda's courage in risking her life to protect her husband's art and memories from censorship, and the inner strength of a single individual against an annihilating authoritarian state. Fabro thus shares Nadezhda's commitment to preserving memory and history as embodied in the human utterance, viewing her words and actions as signs of hope in the manner befitting her name. Fabro was aware of collaboration's important role in the transmission of history, and I quote Fabro, I can identify with Nadezhda, like Nadezhda could identify with Mandelstam, like Mandelstam with Dante, and Dante identified with Virgil. Nadezhda's faithfulness to her husband's poetry makes an association to commitment and fidelity to memory, artistic expression, and the transmission of culture. For the San Francisco show, Nadezhda, the sculptor, would become the protector and transmitter of Fabro's ideas. Beside the sculpture, he placed a simple cardboard box containing my translations of his theoretical texts for audiences to take up and read. From his assumption of the duty to recover and keep alive Carla Lonzi's autoritratto, to Nadezhda's courageous salvation of her husband's poems, for Fabro, culture relies on collaborations, an obligation to transmission that is handed to us as well. Thank you very much.
Sharon, thank you so much for such a rich lecture and for sharing this fascinating material and archival material, much of which I hadn't seen before. I think what you were able to do was draw out some of the real challenges of the problem of thinking about the partnerships and dialogues between artists and in a kind of more private or intimate setting, and particularly in those kind of informal scenarios and the challenge of mediating between the kind of anecdotal personal recollections and public accounts surrounding the artist's work. I want to invite the audience to ask any questions by way of the chat function, but I'd like to start by asking you perhaps to say a little bit more about the image or the photograph that you showed us of the bacia mano. I was particularly struck by your description of that as Lonzi seeking recognition on the part of the artist. And firstly, did I understand correctly that this was a work that was, an image that was conceived by Lonzi? And I wondered what that perhaps suggested about the relationship between Lonzi and Fabro as artist and critic, particularly. It seems to go against the grain of the appeal of Lonzi as someone who was unconventional as a critic, or who wanted to do away with some of those hierarchies. So, yeah.
I don't know. All I do know is the level of specificity with which she had envisioned that photograph and her desire to have that on the cover, and then not understanding myself why that did not happen, and perhaps thinking about a bit more about, and we don't know obviously, but was she being asked to make compromises all along the way, and that somehow she did say in certain places in her diary also her feeling of not being, that she could put herself on an equal position was an incredible feat for a critic. But on the other hand, there is a recollection later in her diaries also that she didn't feel this was a two-way street, because at some point she shows her poetry to one of the young artists, and they tell her it's terrible, and she's completely humiliated. And so she is part of their generative act, but in some ways she doesn't feel that they are a part of hers. And I don't have enough, again, you want to be very respectful of the absences because we don't have complete letters. But I do think that in some ways she was searching for something there that she didn't find in terms of her own creative voice, and that she had so invested so much, autoritratto, the title of her book. And somehow her sense of her own agency may have gotten a bit lost in what she was doing. I think they all felt that she was this incredibly important voice for them. She may have not seen it the same way. And I just wanted to inject a bit more of that into the dialogue to try to see that whole period from her point of view as well. Because, you really think about what it must have meant for her constantly to have to be invited into other people's spaces to be able to express herself. I think, in the same year, a completely different culture, in 1971, Linda Nochlin writes her own book about why there have been no female artists and has her own sense of agency about things. So I could see that this could have been sort of maybe building up in Lonzi over those very few years. They're very intense. She's done something really important, but on the other hand, there might not have been the return for her that she would have wanted.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. I also wondered if you had a chance to examine the extracts that were drawn from Lonzi's manifesto that appeared alongside the Italia de Santa, those photographs, and obviously the entire manifesto wasn't republished in those works or in those collages. So I was wondering if there was any significance between the extracts that she picked.
I think one of them struck me very strongly while I was thinking about Penelope, because she has this line about, one of the lines is, woman, I don't know if I'm saying this exactly right, but woman, every morning she wakes up to see that man has destroyed the work that she has done. And it's such an interesting misreading of the Penelope myth, is that's how she lived it. She really lived that all her work was being undone and by men. And it's a very strong an interesting misreading of the myth, I think. And that is one of the phrases that is on top of the Italia. So that's sort of emblematic to me of how she was feeling as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Lucia who asks, can you comment on the pun in Incubo in connection to the ambivalent relationship with Lonzi and the dream you mentioned at the beginning?
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought of a connection like that. Thank you, Lucia. Since I don't know of any comment that Fabro made on it, I think it would be risky to put words. I think the dream was actually a very tender dream, and very loving. And I think that's why he put it at the preface, because he really wanted to recall, and even his comment that it might have been the medication she was taking for her cancer. In some way, he felt that that there was an affection between them that was very serious and very strong. On the other hand, it might be a mistake to overread Incubo, because he did intend to make it for many other people. So we don't want to also, as I said, romanticize or fetishize and even the film, because this was done on many friends, and it just happens to be that we have this one Incubo or we have that one film by Pirelli, but we don't have a full deck of archival documents to be playing with. So it's an interesting thing to think about, I would say.
And then a question from Nancy Olnick. Could you discuss Fabro's artwork, Eos or the Dawn, from 1997 in terms of his ideas on women, Fabro's ideas on women?
Ooh, that would require an entire essay, I would say, Nancy. That's a fascinating connection, and especially as we know how he conceived it and how he wanted it to be exhibited as well. I sort of tried to stick to mythic figures who had some kind of intelligence to them, and of course, Eos, the goddess of dawn. That's a very important myth also for the birth of modern sculpture, because that the sound of the sound that she is supposed to make when her son comes to visit her makes the sculpture scream, and that's the sort of the idea of the whole birth of modern sculpture is wrapped up into Eos as the goddess of dawn. So that would be another fascinating aspect of Fabro's connection with women and female subjects from myth that I think would require an entire exploration. There were so many to choose from.
Okay, we have a question from Julia Scrippa, who asks, would you connect the need of making the visible or recognizing these collaborations as a way of resisting the idea of the artist as a figure, a genius figure, in favor of a more choral understanding of creativity? And there's a follow-up there as well. If so, what would this mean in practice? And would a new language need to be developed to talk about creativity?
I could not agree more. And I think this was something Fabro was striving for in so many different ways, with the Casa dei Artisti, with the collaborations, even with Lonzi, with the idea that the artwork, the generative artwork, was more significant than the maker and the critic as well. And there is this one work he made called Lo Spirato, where he actually handed out shares to all his friends. And he said, when the value of the artwork goes up, your shares will go up. And value will go down when the shares go down. So he always had the idea that also that when culture is transmitted to everyone, its value goes up. And he says that very much. When he made a monument in Piazza Plebiscito in Naples, he also said that it's the difference between economic value, where one person gains and one person loses when an artwork passes from hand to hand. When an artwork is culturally shared, everybody gains, because it's a dialogue, there is a circular relationship, and I think it's a non-hierarchical relationship. I love the image of the two of them, the opening image. I left it there for so long because of this kind of circular nature of how collaboration moves around among all of us who work in this field, rather than establishing a hierarchy, and especially in Italy, where unfortunately the gender dynamics are very strong in terms of male curators and male critics. And as Lucia said last week, it's a incredibly intricate problem of power structures and struggles. And I think he was trying very hard to work against that grain. And I do agree, we would have to invent an entirely new language. I was trying to be very cautious in certain ways I said things to experiment with a new way to talk about this. And I do believe that collaborations are the way to do that.
Thank you. So there's just a comment from Lucia again. So Penelope's Renowned by Marilyn Katz offers a fascinating reading of Penelope that totally deconstructs the usual reading of her as just faithful and steady. I was fascinated to hear about Yola de Santa because it's she's a figure that certainly in the Anglophone scholarship hasn't received quite as much attention or anything like the attention that Carla Lonzi has received in kind of recent years. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that relationship or the relationship that she has with Fabro and more broadly about her.
Yola was an incredibly original thinker, and she was also extremely committed to art students, to any initiatives. I mean, I didn't really have time to go into so many things that she did for the art world, teaching at Brera, recovering the De Chirico sculpture. She would get people out there, students to, be available to really a deep social commitment to art. And I think that she and Fabro really shared that. And the Casa di Artisti was such a kind of a landmark place in Milan for so many decades. And she was really part of that revival of the Casa. And her books follow Fabro's thinking and writing in a very different way from Lonzi. She records a lot of things that he says. I mean, it's a wonderful living testament. I'm sitting here looking at all the books that she wrote about him that I look at every time I have to sit down and write something about Fabro, plus her incredible interest in the greater history of art and how things fit in. One of the beautiful exhibitions in the 70s is Aptico, is Senso della Scultura, and it's all about that haptic sense that I was talking about just briefly with the Apollo and Daphne. She really should become the subject of study. She died far too young and very tragically, and a living memory of Fabro was lost very quickly. So it's difficult also, I think, in reconstructing his life and his past because of an important voice has been lost.
I have another question about the performances or that relationship between the works that were made in a kind of private, impromptu, or her kind of semi-private life, and the kind of obviously more public works, or that were had a more public life. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the performance that came out of the project of Indumenti and in Munich, that took place in Munich in 1970. That was a one-time thing, right? Or
only been once. The Indumenti apparently, according to Fabro's daughter, that was an ongoing, informal, spontaneous, just like in the Marinella Pirelli film, but probably with others as well. And there was that one time in Munich in Aktionsraum. And in fact, sadly, that image gets mislabeled as Carla Lonzi many times, but it is very important to think that it's not Carla Lonzi. And in fact, the small bra that's in plexiglass, you find it in books as Carla Lonzi's. And it sort of tends to raise her relationship in a way that I think, again, this extension of the artwork outwards to the world by repeating the gesture on many people, by that existence of a world out there, takes it out of that intimate sort of one-on-one relationship that is very important for him for creating, but then there is always the realization that it must go on, which is why I love that last image of Nadezhda with the box with the words, because he really, in those years, was very eager to have American audiences understand him. And in fact, that text is called "I Would Like to Leave a Message for the Americans," because he was very excited by answering machines. It was the first year of "Please leave a message on an answering machine." So we would translate it. There's a wonderful recording that is going to be put on the San Francisco Art Institute's website of that talk. I would like to leave a message where we are translating simultaneously. And his eagerness to have people understand him, even from another culture, it was very touching also. You know, he came that year with a work called Colombo, as if discovering America. So I think, you know, this extension to the world, it's very moving and important. And he did so much, you know, that when I found that old torn up autoritratto of mine, and I noticed that he had actually marked the lines where I should read. Again, this idea that I must transmit this culture, even though Lonzi was so long forgotten by then that nobody even talked about her at the time. But here he was still hand photocopying books for people and giving them out. So yeah, it's a very a sense of ethic and moral responsibility about culture.
Mm. So we have a question from Silvia Petinelli, who thanks you for showing La Vera and writes that your reading was moving and enlightening and wants to know how the materials chosen by Fabro contribute to the work's meaning. I'd also be interested to know a little bit more about the life of that work. Again, something that seems so private and intimate, but as you mentioned, is that, yeah, I mean, it exists in one in Magazzino's collection.
Yeah. So the materials, of course, are always important and symbolic. And if you saw that little sealing wax of two, it has a stamp, an impression on it. And it's very similar to La Vera, which the photo of the two of them, I'm sure you've seen it in Magazzino's collection, has a circular impression from the ring. So obviously, how things are impressed upon one another is both physical and material as well as symbolic. And it means something both in the terms of intimacy, but also in terms of sort of holding those things apart. And it's very interesting because that work can be read very intimately and it can be read very publicly at the same time, and that tension is being held all the time with him between the intimate gesture and the public gesture. And in fact, you know, I've had it here in my room for almost 30 years. I didn't think much of it until I started planning this talk, but he made 250 copies of it to people and friends and, you know, and people he cared about. And so I think it's quite brilliant to hold these two sides together when you think about collaborations, that you are both doing something very private and intimate, but you are also doing something that has a public impact. And again, as I said, it was very delicate to try to hold those two sides together in one discussion of one person, because you don't want to get too much into the personal, but there is a lot of personal trust and intimacy in these relationships that I'm sure we're going to see as well in other talks.
And you did that so wonderfully, Sharon. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for your wonderful paper. And if there aren't any further questions from the audience, then to thank you on behalf of Magazzino, and to welcome everyone back in 2 weeks' time for the second of 3 closer looks at the artists of Arte Povera, and I'll be looking at the work of Alighiero Boetti and his partner Teresa. So thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you all.